Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the freezing oceans of the 17th century, where the world still believed that the greatest fortunes floated upon the backs of whales. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy slow historical journeys like this one. Tonight, dim the lights, relax, and imagine that every creak of timber around you belongs to a weather-beaten ship drifting through endless gray water, where the horizon never promises safety, only another day of exhausting labor. The year is 1673. Dawn has not yet reached the harbor, yet the docks are already alive with muffled footsteps, rattling chains, and the smell of wet rope mixed with stale fish. In a small port crowded with merchant vessels and fishing boats, one ship stands apart. She is neither elegant nor fast. Her hull is broad and scarred from years of punishment. Thick tar covers every seam between her planks. Her masts rise like black trees against the fading stars. This is a whaling ship, and unlike the vessels carrying silk or spices, she sails toward uncertainty with no guarantee that she will ever return. You are not an experienced sailor. In truth, you have signed aboard because there were few other choices. Perhaps your father died owing money. Perhaps the harvest failed once too often. Perhaps the streets of your town offered only hunger. A recruiter promised adventure, wages, and a share of valuable whale oil. He neglected to describe the frostbite, the endless rowing, or the terrifying silence that settles over the sea before disaster arrives. The captain watches as each new crewman climbs aboard. He says little. Experience has taught him that speeches mean nothing against storms. Instead, he studies hands. Soft hands rarely survive long. Calloused hands might last the season. Luck, however, pays no attention to either. The deck feels strangely alive beneath your boots. Every plank groans with the movement of tide and current. Coils of rope lie everywhere, thick as a man's wrist. Heavy wooden barrels are stacked in neat rows, waiting to be filled with precious oil that does not yet exist. Nearby rests an assortment of strange tools unlike anything used aboard ordinary merchant ships. Long iron harpoons glisten faintly in the dim light. Their tips have been sharpened countless times. Beside them stand wooden lances nearly as tall as a man. Everything aboard has one purpose, and that purpose is to hunt creatures far larger than the ship itself. Before sunrise, the cook rings a bell. Breakfast is hardly worth the name. A slab of coarse bread, already hard enough to challenge your teeth, accompanies a cup of weak beer. Fresh water spoils quickly during long voyages, so beer is often safer. No one complains. Veterans know this meal is generous compared with what awaits weeks later. The ship slowly leaves the harbor. Families wave from the shore until faces disappear into mist. Some wives quietly wipe away tears. They understand something many young sailors do not. Departure is often the last farewell. By midday, the coastline has faded completely. The world becomes nothing but sea and sky. At first, this seems beautiful. Gentle waves sparkle beneath pale sunlight. Gulls circle overhead. Salt wind fills your lungs with surprising freshness. You begin to believe the voyage may not be so terrible after all. That illusion survives perhaps 2 days. Life aboard quickly settles into relentless routine. Sleep comes in short intervals determined not by comfort but by necessity. Watches divide the day and night into endless shifts. Whenever your watch begins, you climb onto deck regardless of darkness, rain, or freezing wind. If the sea grows violent, everyone works. There is no privacy aboard. Hammocks hang so close together that when one sailor turns over, 3 others wake with him. The air below deck carries an unforgettable mixture of damp wood, sweat, smoke, mildew, salt, and bodies that cannot be properly washed for months. Rats occasionally dart between barrels searching for crumbs. Nobody wastes energy chasing them. In some ways, the rats are simply fellow passengers. The oldest sailor aboard introduces himself only as Willem. Nobody remembers exactly how many voyages he has completed. His beard has turned almost entirely white, though his shoulders remain surprisingly broad. One evening, he notices you staring toward the empty horizon. "You still think the sea is beautiful," he says quietly. You nod. He smiles in a way that carries no joy. Give it time. Days blend together. Every morning begins with work. Every afternoon continues with work. Every evening promises more of the same. Sailcloth must be repaired, decks scrubbed, ropes inspected, iron tools sharpened, wooden casks cleaned, pumps operated to remove water slowly leaking into the hull. Even the strongest ship is never completely dry. Water constantly finds tiny paths inside. One afternoon, the bosun demonstrates how a harpoon should be thrown. He does not ask volunteers. He simply points toward you. The weapon weighs far more than expected. You are not throwing with your arms, he explains. You throw with your back, your legs, and every ounce of courage left inside you. The harpoon sails only halfway to its target before falling awkwardly into the sea. Laughter spreads across the deck. The bosun does not laugh. If that had been a whale, he says calmly, we would all be dead. No further explanation is necessary. Several weeks pass before the weather changes. The clouds gather without warning, swallowing sunlight until afternoon resembles evening. The wind stiffens. Waves become taller, their smooth surfaces replaced by angry white foam. Orders echo constantly across the deck. Every sail must be adjusted before the storm arrives. You quickly discover that storms do not resemble paintings. Rain falls sideways, driven by wind so fierce it steals breath from your lungs. The ship climbs mountains of water only to plunge violently into valleys between waves. Barrels shift despite heavy ropes holding them in place. Every movement threatens broken bones. At one terrifying moment, the vessel leans so sharply that you become certain she will never recover. Plates, buckets, loose tools, and frightened men all slide together across the deck. Water crashes over the railing with enough force to sweep away anyone not securely holding fast. You cling desperately to soaked rigging. Lightning tears open the sky. For an instant, the entire ocean glows silver. Then darkness returns. Hours later, the storm finally weakens, but no one celebrates. Exhausted sailors silently inspect the damage. A mast has cracked. Several sails are ripped nearly beyond repair. One crewman has disappeared during the night. Nobody witnessed the exact moment he went overboard. The captain records only a single line in his journal. Lost one hand during storm. No ceremony follows. The sea keeps its own records. As the voyage continues farther north, temperatures steadily fall. Morning frost covers the deck. Every rope becomes stiff with ice. Fingers lose feeling within minutes unless constantly moving. Even breathing changes. Each inhale burns with cold. Food worsens. Fresh bread vanished long ago. Salted beef grows increasingly hard and unpleasant. Sometimes tiny worms appear inside ship's biscuits. New sailors react with disgust. Older sailors simply knock out the largest insects and continue eating. Hunger proves stronger than pride. Scurvy quietly begins stalking the crew. Nobody fully understands vitamins in the 17th century. They simply know that after months without fresh fruit, gums swell painfully. Teeth loosen, old wounds reopen, strength fades. Men who seemed healthy only weeks before now struggle climbing simple ladders. The ship's surgeon possesses little more than knives, saws, bandages, herbs, and confidence. Confidence is often his most abundant supply. One evening, Willem sits beside you while sharpening a lance. "You know what frightens me most?" he asks. You assume he means storms. Or perhaps whales. He slowly shakes his head. No. The waiting. He gestures toward the endless gray horizon. You spend months searching. You wonder whether you'll find nothing. And then one morning, he pauses, and you wish you had. His words linger long after conversation ends. Weeks later, just after sunrise, a cry suddenly erupts from the masthead. There she blows. Every head snaps upward. The lookout points toward the distant mist. Far across the water, a tall white column rises into the cold morning air before vanishing again. Then another appears. The captain wastes no time. Every idle conversation dies instantly. Harpoons are inspected. Lines are uncoiled. The great whaleboats are lowered toward the sea. No one smiles. Because every sailor aboard understands one simple truth. The real voyage has only just begun. The sun had not yet fully spread across the ocean when another white column of vapor rose through the mist, as though the sea itself were sending a signal into the morning sky. Every man on deck sprang into motion. The drills they had repeated for weeks were no longer practice. From this moment forward, a single mistake could overturn a boat, wrap a man in a racing harpoon line, or leave him beneath the icy waves, never to be seen again. The captain stood silently with his brass spyglass pressed against one eye. A 17th-century telescope could never match the clarity of modern optics, yet years of experience allowed him to recognize subtle details invisible to younger sailors. After several moments, he lowered the instrument and spoke in a calm voice. Not a sperm whale, most likely a Greenland right whale. Several seasoned crewmen exchanged quiet nods. Among European whalers of the 17th century, right whales were prized above nearly every other species. Th. I swam more slowly than many whales, floated after death instead of sinking, and yielded enormous quantities of valuable blubber that could be rendered into oil. But slower never meant harmless. A creature weighing dozens of tons could shatter a wooden boat with a single violent movement if frightened or wounded. The whale boats hanging alongside the ship were quickly lowered into the sea. The large mothership was never used to chase whales directly. She was simply too heavy and cumbersome. Instead, 6 or 7 men would climb into a narrow open boat and row quietly toward their target. These boats were astonishingly light, allowing experienced oarsmen to glide across the surface with barely a splash. That same lightness, however, made them frighteningly fragile. Your name was called for the third boat. A knot tightened in your stomach. For weeks you had imagined this moment, convincing yourself you would be ready when it arrived. Yet now that it had, every instinct urged you to ask for one more day, one more hour, even one more minute. The sea offered no such luxury. Fear could wait, the oars could not. As you stepped into the boat, an older sailor rested a weathered hand on your shoulder. His name was Matthias. Salt, wind, and decades beneath the northern sun had turned his face into something resembling old leather. He offered only a single warning. Stay clear of the line. Nothing more. You didn't understand why. Within minutes you would. As the whale boat touched the water, the great ship suddenly seemed much farther away than it had moments before. What had felt enormous and reassuring from its deck now appeared little more than a dark silhouette drifting in the mist. Ahead stretched only open sea, and somewhere beyond it, a living giant hidden beneath gray water. The 6 oars entered the sea together. Splash. 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 No one spoke. Only the rhythm of rowing, the distant cries of gulls, and every so often, the deep exhalation of the whale somewhere ahead. The sound was unlike anything you had ever heard. It was not simply breathing. It felt as though the ocean itself had drawn a slow, ancient breath. Whalers of the 17th century understood the importance of silence. A whale could detect disturbances through the water long before men realized it had noticed them. A poorly timed stroke, a shouted command, or the clatter of loose equipment might send the animal diving into the depths, disappearing for hours. The fog gradually began to thin. Then you saw it. At first it looked like a black island floating upon the sea. Then the island moved. Slowly. Unbelievably slowly. An immense back rose from the water, shining beneath the pale morning light. Thousands of droplets rolled from its dark skin like liquid glass. Old scars crossed its body. White patches of barnacles clung stubbornly to its flesh. Long scratches hinted at encounters with drifting Arctic ice years before. You had never imagined an animal this enormous. Today, people grow up watching whales on television and computer screens. In the 17th century, however, an ordinary sailor might spend his entire childhood hearing stories about these creatures without ever believing they truly existed. Standing only a short distance away, the whale seemed almost mythical. The harpooner slowly rose to his feet. The boat scarcely shifted beneath him. Years of practice. An iron harpoon rested comfortably in his hands. His breathing remained slow. His eyes never left the whale. Closer. Closer still. The whale appeared completely unaware. Now, the harpoon flew. A heartbeat later came the unmistakable clang of iron striking flesh. The sea exploded. The whale twisted with astonishing power, hurling mountains of freezing water high into the air. Sheets of icy spray crashed over the boat, soaking every man from head to toe. The little craft lurched violently beneath your feet. Then came the danger Matthias had warned you about. The thick rope attached to the harpoon suddenly began racing from its coil. It moved so quickly your eyes could barely follow it. The line hissed across the wood. Faster! Faster! As if a boot, a hand, or even the edge of a coat became caught beneath that rope, the unlucky sailor would be dragged into the sea before anyone could react. Many whalers died this way. Some drowned. Some were pulled beneath the surface and never recovered. Others suffered terrible injuries as the line tightened with irresistible force. Instinctively, you jerked your foot backward. A single loop of rope whipped across the place where your boot had rested only an instant before. Had you hesitated, this story might have ended there. The wounded whale surged forward with tremendous strength, towing the small boat behind it like a child's toy. Later generations would call this terrifying ride the Nantucket Sleigh Ride asterisk, though whalers had experienced the phenomenon long before the phrase became famous. There was no need to row now. The whale did all the pulling. The speed was astonishing. Cold wind slashed across your face like sharpened knives. Nobody spoke. Everyone waited. Every experienced sailor knew exactly what came next. The whale could not maintain this pace forever. Eventually, it would grow tired. And that was when the most dangerous work truly began. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the animal finally slowed. It dove. It surfaced. Each breath emerged louder than the one before. The harpooner spoke quietly. Lance ready. The next stage required even greater courage. No more throwing weapons from a distance. Now the boat had to approach until it floated almost beside the whale itself. The long killing lance would be thrust toward the lungs again and again. Strength alone was not enough. Patience mattered just as much. The whale surfaced once more. The boat drifted silently alongside it. You were close enough to see every scar, every barnacle, every tiny creature clinging stubbornly to its skin. The harpooner raised the lance. Once, twice, 3 times. Each strike sent another shudder through the immense body. But the struggle was not over. Without warning, the whale's enormous tail rose high into the air. Down, someone shouted. A fraction of a second later, the tail crashed into the sea with unbelievable force. A wall of water struck the boat. For one horrifying instant, it seemed certain the vessel would capsize. One oarsman lost his oar. Another nearly disappeared into the sea before a shipmate seized his coat and hauled him back aboard. Silence followed. Only the whale's heavy breathing remained. Then slowly, the water around the animal began turning red. Dark crimson spread across the cold blue sea. Beautiful in one sense, deeply unsettling in another. The whale still floated, but its strength was fading. Experienced whalers called this final desperate struggle the flurry asterisk. Even while dying, the animal could summon astonishing bursts of power. Wise crews remained alert until the very end. Only then did you begin to understand something the sea had been trying to teach from the very beginning. The first danger is rarely the greatest. Sometimes the deadliest moment arrives just before victory seems certain. And waiting beyond this battle lay another ordeal that no recruiter had ever described. The whale would have to be secured alongside the ship, stripped of its immense blanket of blubber with long cutting spades, and worked day and night until every valuable piece had been hauled aboard. The freezing northern air would soon mix with smoke, boiling oil, blood, and a smell so overwhelming that sailors often claimed it clung to their clothes, their skin, and even their dreams long after they finally returned home. The whale drifted almost motionless now, rising and falling with the slow rhythm of the sea. Nobody in the boat celebrated. Not a single cheer escaped the exhausted crew. Men who had spent years hunting these giants understood that hope could be as dangerous as panic. More than one whale had appeared defeated, only to summon enough strength for one final violent charge that shattered boats and scattered sailors across the freezing water. The harpooner kept one hand on the lance, watching every movement. "Wait." His voice was barely louder than the waves. No one questioned him. The enormous creature floated on its side for several minutes. Every breath became weaker. The powerful spout that had once risen high into the sky had shrunk into little more than a misty sigh. Gradually, the great tail stopped moving altogether. Only then did the captain's signal arrive from the distant ship. A small white flag was raised above the quarterdeck. The hunt was over. The work had only begun. If you imagined that killing the whale would be the hardest part of the voyage, the next several days would quickly prove otherwise. The men secured heavy ropes around the whale's tail and jaw before beginning the painfully slow journey back to the ship. The massive body outweighed the little whale boat by an unimaginable margin. Every stroke of the oars felt heavier than the last. Sometimes the current worked against them. Sometimes the wind seemed determined to drag the carcass in another direction. The great ship finally loomed out of the fog late that afternoon. Even before anyone spoke, sailors lining the rail had already begun preparing block and tackle, hooks, and cutting tools. They had performed this grim ritual countless times before. As the whale reached the ship's side, another strange transformation took place. The hunter became a butcher. The ocean became a floating workshop. And every man aboard was expected to contribute. The carcass was lashed securely alongside the hull until it floated almost parallel with the vessel. Looking down from the deck, you realized just how enormous it truly was. From the whale boat, only sections of its body had been visible at any one time. Now the entire animal stretched beneath the ship like a floating hill of dark flesh. Its eye remained half open, clouded, still. For reasons you could not explain, you found it difficult to look away. Old Willem noticed. "The first one always stays with you," he said quietly. "After enough voyages." He paused. "You stop seeing the eyes." No one asked what he meant. Perhaps nobody wanted the answer. Large iron hooks were driven deep into the thick layer of blubber covering the whale's body. Using massive wooden windlasses turned by teams of sailors, the crew slowly peeled away enormous strips of fat. Each strip measured several feet across and weighed hundreds of pounds. The process had a name: flensing. It required extraordinary teamwork. One man guided the cutting spade. Another controlled the ropes. Others turned the windlass with steady rhythm. Every mistake carried consequences. If the blubber strip tore unexpectedly, men could lose their footing. If the hook slipped free under tension, they could fly across the deck with enough force to break bones. Nothing aboard a whaling ship was ever truly safe. The smell arrived long before sunset. It was unlike the odor of fish, unlike spoiled meat, unlike anything you had encountered on land. Warm blubber released a thick, oily scent that mixed with salt water, blood, wet timber, smoke, sweat, and tar. Within hours, it seemed to coat the inside of your nose. Veteran sailors barely noticed. New hands struggled to swallow without gagging. The ship's cook laughed as he watched another young sailor lose his supper over the rail. "You'll get used to it." Whether that was reassurance or a warning remained unclear. Once enough blubber had been hauled aboard, another stage began. Large pieces were carried toward the brick furnace built directly into the deck. Modern readers often imagine whales being processed after returning to port. In many 17th-century voyages, however, much of the blubber was rendered into oil while still at sea. The longer raw blubber remained untouched, the more valuable oil could be lost through decay. The furnace was called the tryworks. Iron pots, each large enough to swallow a man, sat above roaring fires. Chunks of blubber were sliced into smaller pieces known as Bible leaves because their thin layers reminded sailors of delicate pages. Those pale strips disappeared into boiling cauldrons. Slowly, fat became liquid. Golden whale oil collected beneath the bubbling surface. The heat surprised you more than anything else. Outside, icy northern winds swept across the deck. Near the tryworks, the air shimmered with intense warmth. Men worked stripped to their shirts despite the freezing weather. The smoke drifted continuously upward, coating sails and rigging with black soot. The ship no longer smelled merely unpleasant. It smelled industrial, as though an entire factory had somehow been built upon floating timber. The captain inspected every barrel personally. Whale oil was worth an extraordinary fortune in Europe. It illuminated homes, churches, and city streets. It lubricated machinery. It supplied workshops. Before petroleum transformed the world, whale oil was one of the most valuable commodities crossing the Atlantic. Each full barrel represented wages, debt repaid, families fed, perhaps even a small piece of land purchased back home. Every sailor knew exactly how much depended upon filling those casks, which explained why they kept working despite exhaustion, despite freezing rain, despite bleeding hands, despite barely sleeping. 3 days passed in this relentless cycle. Cut, lift, boil, fill, repeat. Your shoulders burned constantly. Small blisters on your palms had already burst open, leaving raw skin beneath. Saltwater found every crack. Even holding a spoon during supper became painful. Sleep offered little relief. Each morning, new muscles seemed to ache. The surgeon examined your hands briefly. Good. You stared at him. They're hardening. Apparently, pain itself was considered progress. Late one evening, as darkness settled across the sea, Willem invited you to sit beside the stern. Neither of you spoke for several minutes. Only the slow creaking of the ship filled the silence. Finally, he asked, "Do you know what kills most whalers?" You answered cautiously, "Whales." He smiled faintly. "That's what everyone believes." He pointed toward the horizon. "No. The sea kills some. Disease kills more. Bad luck kills a few. But routine." He looked back toward the glowing tryworks. "A routine kills the rest." Seeing her confusion, he continued, "Men stop paying attention. They've survived storms. They've survived the hunt. They think tomorrow will look exactly like today. Then they step beneath a swinging hook. They slip on blubber. They fall into boiling oil. They miss one command. And suddenly, he snapped his fingers. They're gone. History supports his warning. Whaling ships were among the most dangerous workplaces of the 17th century, not only because of whales, but because every stage of the voyage involved constant physical hazards. Heavy equipment, open fires, sharp blades, slippery decks, and endless fatigue combined into a deadly routine. The following morning proved Willem's point. Rain had frozen overnight. The deck resembled polished glass. A young sailor named Thomas hurried while carrying a cutting spade across the waist of the ship. Someone shouted, "Too late." His boot slipped. The heavy blade flew from his hands. For one terrifying heartbeat, it spun through the air before crashing into the deck only inches from another sailor's leg. Silence spread across the crew. The captain walked over without raising his voice. He simply picked up the spade, handed it back, then ordered Thomas to scrub the entire deck after supper. No shouting, no whipping, no dramatic punishment. The lesson had already been delivered. Everyone had witnessed how close death had come. That afternoon, another lookout climbed into the crow's nest, scanning the gray horizon once again. Most people imagine whalers hunting one whale before sailing home. Reality was far less forgiving. A profitable voyage demanded many whales. The barrels stacked deep inside the ship were still only partially full. The captain wanted every empty cask filled before winter ice trapped them in northern waters. Near sunset, the lookout suddenly stiffened. He raised one arm, then another. His voice echoed across the sea. "There she blows." The words rolled across the deck like distant thunder. Another whale. Another hunt. Another chance to grow richer. Or another opportunity for the sea to remind every man aboard that survival was never guaranteed, no matter how successful yesterday had been. The cry from the masthead had barely faded before the rhythm of the ship changed once again. Men who only moments earlier had been dragging blubber across the deck abandoned their work and hurried to their stations. There was no hesitation, no discussion, and certainly no excitement. The veterans had learned long ago that treating a whale hunt like a celebration was one of the quickest paths to disaster. The captain climbed onto the quarterdeck and raised his spyglass. The sea looked different this afternoon. A fresh wind had begun blowing from the northwest, pushing long swells beneath the hull. Low clouds drifted across the sky, turning the afternoon light into a dull silver. Visibility came and went as patches of mist slid across the water like slow-moving ghosts. "There are 3 of them," the captain finally announced. "Not one whale." 3. That might sound like good fortune. In reality, it created an entirely different problem. A lone whale usually behaved predictably. A small group could scatter in different directions without warning, forcing each whale boat to make difficult decisions. Chase the wrong animal and another crew might lose the better opportunity. Chase too aggressively and the whales could panic together, disappearing beneath the surface for hours. The officers gathered briefly around the captain. No raised voices. No dramatic arguments. Only quick calculations. The first mate would take the port boat. The second mate would lead the starboard boat. The third boat, your boat, would remain slightly behind, ready to support whichever crew found itself in trouble. It was not the most glorious assignment, but experienced captains knew that rescue boats often saved more lives than successful hunters. The boats were lowered once again. Your arms protested as you gripped the oar. Yesterday's labor had left every muscle aching. There was no time to recover. Life aboard a whaling ship rarely cared whether a man was tired. The boats glided away from the ship in a wide formation. Ahead, 3 white spouts rose into the cold air at irregular intervals. One, then another, then a third farther to the east. The whales appeared to be feeding peacefully. Occasionally one rolled gently near the surface before disappearing beneath the gray water. The first mate quietly signaled his crew to angle toward the nearest whale. The second mate turned after another. Your boat remained between them, rowing steadily while watching both hunts unfold. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. Only the steady splash of oars. Then everything changed. The whale pursued by the first mate suddenly slapped the water with its tail. Not once, twice. The captain aboard the distant ship could not hear the sound, but every man in the boats could. The animal had sensed danger. It surged forward with astonishing speed. The first mate's crew dug their oars deep into the sea, trying desperately to close the distance before the whale disappeared. At almost the same moment, another spout erupted much closer than anyone expected. One of the whales had surfaced, directly beside your boat. It seemed impossible. A creature so immense should have announced its arrival with thunder. Instead, it rose almost silently. The whale's back emerged less than 30 yards away. Its skin glistened with seawater. Barnacles dotted its head like rough white stones. For a brief instant, one enormous eye turned toward your boat. Whether it truly saw you or merely looked in your direction, no one could say. Every man froze. The whale remained perfectly still. Even the sea seemed to stop breathing. Then, with extraordinary grace for something so enormous, it rolled slightly and slipped beneath the surface. The water closed above it. Gone. No splash. No violence. Only widening circles spread across the sea. The harpooner lowered his weapon. "Too close," he whispered. No one argued. Throwing from that angle would have been reckless. A wounded whale beneath the boat could easily strike upward or overturn the craft before anyone escaped. Sometimes the safest decision was to let opportunity swim away. That lesson disappointed young sailors more than storms ever could. Several minutes later, the second mate's boat suddenly erupted into motion. His harpoon had found its mark. The familiar hiss of racing line echoed faintly across the water. Your officer immediately ordered the crew forward. Row. The rescue boat was needed. Not because the hunt had failed, because success itself could become dangerous. Every muscle in your body screamed as you pulled against the oar. The boat leaped across the waves. Ahead, the wounded whale was dragging the second mate's crew at terrifying speed. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of fleeing in a straight line, the whale turned sharply, directly toward the mother ship. The distance closed rapidly. A collision between a panicked whale and a wooden vessel weighing hundreds of tons might sound impossible. History proved otherwise. Whales had damaged rudders, smashed boats against hulls, and on rare occasions struck ships with astonishing force. The captain immediately ordered sails adjusted. The great ship slowly changed course. Not to chase, to avoid. The wounded whale crossed only a few hundred yards ahead of the bow before diving. The harpoon line followed it beneath the sea. Then everything stopped. The line became perfectly vertical. No movement. No sound. The whale had sounded. A deep dive. This was another dangerous phase of the hunt. No one knew how long the animal would remain below. 5 minutes. 20. An hour. The rope disappeared into dark water, stretched tight as an iron bar. Every sailor watched it carefully. If the whale suddenly surged sideways beneath the surface, the line could snap without warning. A breaking whale line behaved like a gigantic whip. Men struck by one were often killed instantly. The officer quietly ordered everyone to keep clear. You remembered Matthias's first warning. Stay clear of the line. Now you understood even better. Time passed slowly. The sea grew strangely calm. Even the gulls seemed quieter. Then, the rope twitched. Once. Twice. Here it comes, someone muttered. The water several yards away began to bulge upward. Bubbles reached the surface. Suddenly, the whale burst from the sea in an explosion of foam. Although right whales rarely breached completely, wounded animals sometimes behaved unpredictably. Its massive head rose astonishingly high before crashing back into the water with a deafening roar. The wave rolled outward like a miniature tsunami. Your boat climbed sharply before slamming back down. Cold spray blinded everyone. For several terrifying seconds, nothing was visible except white water. When your vision cleared, you saw the second mate's boat listing dangerously to one side. One oar had snapped clean in half. Another floated uselessly several yards away. Fortunately, every man remained aboard. Your crew reached them within moments. Extra oars were passed across. A replacement line was secured. The hunt resumed. No one complained. Broken equipment was expected. Broken men were harder to replace. By late evening, the second whale finally succumbed. This victory, however, carried little joy. Two sailors had suffered broken fingers while handling the line. One man had taken a heavy blow to the ribs from a swinging oar. Another had narrowly escaped being crushed between the whale and the boat. The surgeon examined them one by one after returning to the ship. His treatments were painfully simple. Splints made from thin strips of wood. Bandages soaked in spirits. Needles and coarse thread for torn flesh. A generous measure of rum whenever it was available. There were no antiseptics. No x-rays. No antibiotics. A minor wound that would be easily treated today could become life-threatening after weeks at sea. That night, as darkness settled over the Arctic waters, the crew gathered for supper. Salt beef, ship's biscuit, peas porridge thick enough to stand a spoon upright. No one talked much. Exhaustion had replaced conversation. Only Willem spoke after several minutes of silence. You know the strangest thing about this life. You looked toward him. It's not the whales. He tore a piece of hard biscuit in half. It's how quickly impossible things become ordinary. He gestured toward the deck above. A month ago, you'd never seen a whale. Today, you've watched two hunted, processed one, nearly lost another boat, and tomorrow you'll wake up believing it's simply another day's work. He smiled sadly. That's how the sea changes a man. Outside, beyond the circle of lantern light, the endless northern ocean stretched into darkness. Somewhere beneath those cold waters, countless whales still migrated through ancient routes that humans barely understood. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another danger was beginning to gather, not from the whales, but from the sky itself. The experienced sailors had already noticed the subtle signs. The falling air pressure, the uneasy silence of the seabirds, and the long, heavy swell rolling in from the northwest. A far more merciless opponent than any whale was on its way, and unlike the creatures they hunted, a storm could not be outrun, outsmarted, or wounded. The morning arrived without a sunrise. Instead of the pale golden light that usually crept over the horizon, the crew awoke beneath a ceiling of thick gray clouds. The ocean had taken on the color of forged iron, and the boundary between sea and sky had nearly vanished. Everything seemed muted. Even the waves, though larger than before, moved with an unsettling steadiness, as if gathering strength rather than spending it. Experienced sailors noticed such things immediately. The younger hands noticed only that the air felt strangely heavy. Old Willem stood near the bow, breathing deeply. "You smell that?" "You inhaled." "Salt." "Smoke from the tryworks." "Tar." "Nothing unusual." He shook his head. "The wind has changed." At first, his words made little sense. Wind had no scent, at least none that you could recognize. Yet the older sailors often claimed they could smell weather before they could see it. Whether that came from experience or simple instinct, few men laughed at such observations. The captain certainly did not. He climbed into the rigging himself, something he rarely bothered to do unless the situation demanded it. From high above the deck, he studied the western horizon for nearly 10 minutes before descending without a word. That silence worried everyone more than any shouted order could have. Within minutes, commands echoed across the ship. "Secure the boats." "Double the lashings." "Strike unnecessary canvas." The deck erupted into activity. Every loose barrel was tightened. Every coil of rope was checked twice. The whale boats were pulled higher against the ship's sides and bound with additional lines. The tryworks fire, which had burned almost continuously for days, was extinguished. There would be no rendering today. Open flames and heavy seas were a deadly combination. You helped secure several barrels of whale oil below deck. Each cask weighed hundreds of pounds. If one broke loose during a storm, it could crash through men and equipment alike like a rolling cannonball. Many sailors feared loose cargo almost as much as the sea itself. The preparations lasted nearly 3 hours. Then, nothing. The wind faded. Completely. The sails hung limp against the masts. The ocean became strangely smooth, despite the heavy swells still rolling beneath the hull. It felt wrong, almost unnatural. One sailor smiled. "Perhaps the storm has passed us by." No veteran answered, because they knew this eerie calm often came before the worst weather. Without warning, the temperature dropped. Not gradually. Suddenly. Your breath became visible. Tiny crystals of ice began forming along the rail. The clouds overhead darkened until midday resembled twilight. Then the first gust arrived. It struck the sails with a loud crack. Not especially powerful. Just enough to make every sailor stop what he was doing. The second gust came harder. The third was harder still. Within minutes, the calm had vanished. The ship leaned sharply as fresh wind filled what little canvas remained. The captain wasted no time. "Reef everything." Men scrambled into the rigging. This was among the most dangerous jobs aboard any sailing vessel. There were no safety harnesses, no lifelines, only cold fingers gripping wet ropes 30, 40, sometimes 50 feet above a wildly moving deck. You watched one sailor climb toward the topsail yard. His movements appeared almost effortless. Then the ship rolled unexpectedly. For a terrifying instant, his body swung completely free beneath the yardarm. Only one arm remained wrapped around the spar. Several men below instinctively looked away. Nobody wanted to witness another fall. Miraculously, he regained his balance. His work continued as though nothing had happened. No applause followed. On a whaling ship, surviving another minute rarely deserved celebration. By afternoon, the sea had transformed completely. The long, gentle swells disappeared beneath steep, chaotic waves. Foam raced across their tops like blowing snow. Rain began falling sideways. It barely resembled rain anymore. The wind hurled each drop hard enough to sting exposed skin. Conversation became impossible. Orders were communicated through hand signals, whistles, and shouted fragments that vanished into the gale. The ship climbed one enormous wave. For several breathtaking seconds, you could see nothing but endless gray water stretching toward every horizon. Then the bow tipped downward. The vessel plunged into the trough below. Everything not securely fastened lurched forward. You nearly lost your footing despite clinging desperately to the rail. The impact shook the entire ship. Wood groaned. Rigging screamed overhead. Somewhere below deck came the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. The storm had only begun. Hour after hour, the weather intensified. Each wave seemed determined to climb higher than the last. Water swept repeatedly across the deck, filling every corner before draining back into the sea. The pumps never stopped. Even a well-built wooden ship leaked constantly. During storms, those leaks increased dramatically. The teams of sailors worked in exhausting shifts, pumping seawater back overboard before it accumulated inside the hull. It was dirty, repetitive labor. It also meant the difference between floating and sinking. Late that evening, another cry spread across the deck. Main topsails gone. Everyone looked upward. The upper portion of the sail had ripped almost completely free. Hundreds of square feet of heavy canvas now snapped violently in the wind like the wing of some gigantic bird. If left alone, it could tear away more rigging or pull men from the yards. The captain pointed toward a group of sailors. "You four. You were one of them." Your stomach tightened. Climbing during calm weather had been frightening enough. Climbing now bordered on madness. But refusal was never considered. You followed the others toward the shrouds. Rain soaked every rung. The mast swayed with alarming rhythm. One hand above the other. 1 foot higher. Do not look down. Do not think about the sea. Halfway up, a violent gust slammed into the mast. The entire world lurched sideways. Your body swung away from the wood. For one terrifying heartbeat, only your hands kept you alive. The roar of the wind drowned every other sound. Below, the deck appeared impossibly small. Far beneath that, only black water. You wrapped one arm tighter around the mast and forced yourself upward. The others were already reaching the damaged yard. There was no elegant solution. The torn sail had to be wrestled under control by hand. Canvas soaked with seawater became astonishingly heavy. The wind fought every movement. Several times it felt as though the sail itself were trying to throw you into the ocean. Your fingers quickly became numb. Not merely cold. Numb. The rope burned your palms even through wet gloves. Minutes stretched into eternity. Finally, after what felt like an entire lifetime, the damaged canvas was secured. One sailor laughed with relief. The sound vanished instantly beneath another blast of wind. Descending proved even more difficult than climbing. The ship continued rolling violently. Each step required complete concentration. When your boots finally touched the deck again, your legs trembled so badly you could barely stand. The bosun clapped your shoulder. Now you're beginning to earn your share. There was no time to rest. Another wave crashed across the bow. This one carried something unexpected. A section of heavy timber, washed loose from somewhere forward, came sliding across the flooded deck. It struck a young sailor squarely in the thigh. The crack echoed even above the storm. He collapsed instantly. Two nearby crewmen dragged him clear before the timber disappeared over the opposite rail. The surgeon reached him within moments. After a brief examination, he looked toward the captain and quietly shook his head. The leg was badly broken. There would be no proper healing until land. If infection set in. No one finished that thought aloud. As darkness deepened, the storm reached a terrifying new intensity. Lightning flashed across the clouds, illuminating enormous walls of water surrounding the ship. For brief instants, every face appeared ghostly white. Then complete darkness returned. The compass lantern swung wildly. The helm required 2 men instead of 1. Even the captain remained at the wheel for part of the night. He trusted no one else. If the ship during weather like this. Around midnight, a tremendous crack echoed from somewhere above. Every sailor froze. The foremast shuddered. Not broken. Not yet. But something had failed high in the rigging. Loose blocks and tangled lines whipped through the darkness, invisible except when lightning briefly illuminated them. The captain stared upward. No immediate repair was possible. Any man sent aloft now would almost certainly die. For the first time since leaving port, you saw genuine concern on his face. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. If that mast goes. He never completed the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone aboard understood. A crippled whaling ship hundreds of miles from shore had little chance of reaching home. And the storm showed no sign of mercy. In fact, the oldest sailors aboard had begun exchanging uneasy glances. They had survived many tempests over decades at sea, yet something about this one felt different. The wind was still increasing instead of fading. The barometer had dropped farther than anyone could remember, and somewhere beyond the darkness came a deep, thunderous sound that did not belong to thunder at all. It was a noise few men ever forgot once they had heard it, a sound that suggested the sea itself was breaking apart. No one could tell exactly where the sound had come from. It was too deep to be thunder, too long to be the crack of timber. It rolled beneath the roar of the storm itself, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to rise from the ocean rather than the sky. Even the oldest sailors fell silent for a moment, each man listening as though the sea were trying to tell them something. Then Willem quietly spoke. "Ice." The word carried across the deck despite the wind. Not everyone heard him. Those who did immediately looked toward the darkness ahead. By the late 17th century, European whalers regularly pushed farther into Arctic waters than most merchant captains would ever dare. They hunted near the edge of the drifting pack ice around Greenland and Spitsbergen, because whales often gathered in those rich feeding grounds during the warmer months. Yet every experienced captain knew that the same ice capable of attracting whales could also destroy a ship without warning. The rumbling came again. Longer this time. Not a roar. More like the grinding of enormous stones beneath the earth. Except there were no stones. Only moving mountains of frozen seawater. Lightning briefly illuminated the horizon. For a single heartbeat, you saw them. White cliffs. Jagged. Towering above the waves. Not land. Ice. Enormous sheets of pack ice drifted through the darkness, rising and falling with the swell like floating fortresses. Some pieces stood higher than the ship's mast. Others stretched so far into the night that their edges disappeared completely. One younger sailor whispered a prayer. Another crossed himself. Nobody mocked either gesture. The captain wasted no time. The starboard helm. The helmsman strained against the great wooden tiller. Turning a heavily laden whaling ship during calm weather required effort. Turning one during a gale bordered on impossible. The bow answered slowly. Far too slowly. Every passing second allowed wind and waves to push the vessel closer toward the drifting ice. Another flash of lightning. Closer now. Much closer. The grinding noise became deafening. Massive slabs collided with one another, splintering into smaller fragments before crashing together again under unimaginable pressure. It sounded as though the earth itself were breaking apart. Unlike solid icebergs, pack ice never remained still. It drifted constantly. Opened. Closed. Moved with currents invisible from the surface. A narrow channel wide enough for safe passage could disappear within minutes. The captain knew that. So did every Arctic sailor aboard. He pointed toward the foredeck. Sound the leads. Although deep ocean surrounded them, hidden shoals or submerged ice could still present danger near certain Arctic coasts. A sailor hurried forward with a lead line, more from habit than expectation. Another order followed immediately. Keep every lantern shielded. A strong light reflecting from rain and mist could destroy what little night vision remained. Darkness was frightening. Blindness was worse. The ship continued edging toward the ice. No one spoke above a whisper. Even shouting felt somehow disrespectful before something so vast. The nearest floe finally emerged from the darkness. Its surface was uneven, scarred by years of freezing and thawing. Blue cracks glowed faintly beneath fresh snow. Chunks the size of cottages drifted around its edges. One collision with that frozen wall could stove in the hull below the waterline. Wood stood little chance against Arctic ice. The captain's face remained expressionless. Inside, however, calculations raced faster than any storm. Wind SB. Yield. Current. Distance. Sail pressure. Weight of cargo. Every decision mattered. Brace. The command echoed across the ship. Men grabbed whatever solid timber they could reach. The bow swung. Slowly. Painfully slowly. For one dreadful moment, it appeared they would strike broadside. Instead, the ship slid past the edge of the ice with what seemed no more than a few yards to spare. A scraping sound echoed beneath the hull. Every heart stopped. Had they hit? The ship shuddered. Once, then continued forward. No water rushed below. No splintering timbers. Only a shallow graze. A collective breath escaped the crew. Too soon. Because the first floe had merely concealed another. Smaller. Harder to see. Drifting directly across their new course. There. A lookout pointed desperately into the rain. The second obstacle arrived almost immediately. There was no room to turn again. The captain made a decision few merchant captains would ever consider. Hard to port. Several sailors stared in disbelief. Turning toward the larger waves seemed almost suicidal. But remaining on the present course guaranteed collision. The helm groaned. The sails strained. Wind howled through every line aboard. The ship climbed an enormous swell at exactly the right moment. As the bow rose, the current nudged the smaller ice floe just enough for the stern to slide narrowly behind it. Had either wave or current arrived a few seconds earlier or later, the outcome might have been very different. History is filled with ships lost because fortune arrived one heartbeat too late. Rain gradually changed. First to sleet, then to snow. Large wet flakes clung instantly to every rope and spar. Ice began forming around pulleys. Blocks that had moved freely only hours earlier now resisted every pull. The rigging itself grew heavier, more dangerous. Sailors climbed repeatedly to knock accumulating ice from the yards using wooden mallets. The work never ended. Leave too much weight overhead, and a mast could fail under the strain. One sailor returned from the rigging with blood running freely from his fingertips. He hadn't noticed. The cold had numbed them completely. The surgeon wrapped the wounds in linen. There. The sailor nodded, then returned immediately to work. Pain waited until survival no longer required attention. Near dawn, the wind finally eased. Not enough to call the storm over. Enough for men to hear one another without shouting. The captain ordered hot broth distributed. The cook produced a thin mixture of salted meat, peas, and barley. Under ordinary circumstances, few would have praised it. This morning, it tasted magnificent. Warmth mattered more than flavor. Steam rose from wooden bowls as exhausted sailors leaned against the bulwarks. Nobody spoke much. Everyone simply watched the gray sea. Counting. Breathing. Still alive. You noticed Thomas, the sailor who had nearly injured another man days earlier when he slipped with the cutting spade. He looked older now. Not in years. In expression. Storms had a habit of doing that. They stripped away whatever illusions remained. During a quiet moment, you asked Willem whether every voyage felt like this. He considered the question carefully. No. You waited. Some are worse. He smiled faintly. The fortunate captains are the ones who never discover how much worse. That answer lingered with you. Because it suggested the sea still possessed lessons none of you had yet experienced. As daylight slowly strengthened, the full cost of the storm became visible. One whale boat had been smashed against the ship despite extra lashings. Several spars required replacement. A section of the starboard rail had vanished completely. The torn topsail could not be repaired without calm weather. Worst of all, the ship had drifted many miles from the rich whaling grounds they had been carefully following. Weeks of searching could now be lost. The captain studied his charts inside the great cabin. Navigation in the 17th century depended upon dead reckoning, compass headings, estimated speed, and occasional celestial observations when skies permitted. After several days of cloud and storm, even the most skilled navigator could only estimate his exact position. And in Arctic waters, an error of 20 or 30 miles could mean the difference between finding whales or finding only empty sea. Yet another concern now troubled the officers. Several casks of fresh water had shifted during the storm, and two had cracked open below deck. Combined with the longer voyage caused by being blown off course, it meant that supplies already carefully rationed might no longer last as comfortably as anyone had hoped. The whales were no longer the crew's only source of anxiety. Hunger and thirst, the quiet enemies of every long voyage, had just stepped aboard. The damaged water casks were discovered shortly after sunrise. At first, the loss did not appear alarming. Only 2 barrels had split when they slammed repeatedly against their restraints during the storm, compared with the dozens of casks still store. Deep below deck, the damage seemed manageable. But the cooper, the sailor responsible for maintaining barrels, knelt beside the broken staves and frowned. He ran a rough hand through the puddle collecting between the deck beams. Then he quietly called for the captain. Within minutes, several officers had gathered below. No one raised their voice. That alone told the experienced sailors the situation deserved attention. The captain crouched beside the shattered casks. "How much?" The cooper answered carefully. "Enough to matter." It was an honest response. Fresh water was unlike whale oil. It could not simply be replaced in the middle of the Greenland Sea. Every gallon lost had to be accounted for. In the 17th century, long ocean voyages depended upon careful planning. Rainwater could occasionally be collected during storms, but salt spray often contaminated it. Rivers and fresh springs existed only where land existed, and land in the high Arctic was both scarce and dangerous to approach. The captain emerged from below deck carrying a small ledger. Without ceremony, he announced a new ration. Every sailor would receive less fresh water beginning immediately. Beer would continue to be issued whenever possible. Cooking water would be measured more carefully. No exceptions. No complaints. The announcement produced little reaction. Most of the crew had expected something similar. They had sailed too long to believe storms ended without consequences. Breakfast reflected the new reality. The usual mug of watered beer remained. The portion of porridge seemed slightly smaller. No one mentioned it. Men simply ate in silence. Even conversation required energy. Later that morning, the cooper gathered several younger sailors, including you. If these barrels fail, he tapped another cask with a wooden mallet. Nothing else matters. Unlike modern barrels made with metal fasteners and industrial precision, 17th-century casks relied almost entirely upon carefully shaped wooden staves held together by iron hoops. When the wood dried too much, gaps appeared. When it swelled excessively, pressure created different problems. Keeping barrels sound was nearly a full-time occupation. You helped remove damaged hoops before fitting replacements forged months earlier back in port. Each strike of the hammer echoed through the hold. The smell below deck was overwhelming. Tar, oak, salt, whale oil, smoke, wet rope, mold, human bodies. The ship had become its own small world, a floating village sealed inside timber walls. During the afternoon, another problem announced itself. The cook held up a biscuit before the assembled crew. Small holes covered its surface. He broke it apart. Tiny white worms wriggled inside. Several new sailors grimaced. The older men barely looked up from their meals. Willem chuckled. "They've beaten us to breakfast." Laughter spread quietly through the mess. Not because the joke was particularly funny, because humor remained one of the few luxuries still available. Ship's biscuit, often called hardtack, formed the backbone of long voyages. Baked until nearly all moisture disappeared, it could survive for months or even years if kept dry. Unfortunately, insects often survived as well. Most sailors simply knocked the biscuits against the table. The larger weevils fell out. The rest added protein. One young recruit stared at his untouched meal. "I can't." Willem shrugged. "You will. By evening." He did. Hunger has always been one of history's greatest persuaders. The following day dawned surprisingly calm. For the first time since the storm, sunlight pierced the clouds. Golden rays reflected across countless pieces of drifting ice, transforming the sea into a field of glittering crystal. Even hardened sailors paused to admire the view. Beauty often appeared unexpectedly in the Arctic. It simply never remained for long. The captain ordered repairs throughout the ship. Broken railings, damaged rigging, splintered whale boats. Every carpenter aboard immediately found himself overwhelmed with work. The ship's carpenter, Master Elias, possessed perhaps the most valuable hands aboard after the captain himself. A damaged mast, a cracked yard, a leaking hull, all eventually became his responsibility. Watching him work felt almost magical. With little more than saws, adzes, chisels, wooden pegs, and remarkable experience, he transformed shattered timber into seaworthy repairs. Modern shipyards would have required cranes and machinery. He required patience. You spent much of the afternoon helping replace shattered planking on one whale boat. Each board had to match the curve of the hull almost perfectly. Even the smallest mistake could allow water inside during the next hunt. Elias noticed your curiosity. You know why ships survive. You expected some complicated explanation involving craftsmanship. Instead, he smiled. Because wood forgives. Seeing your puzzled expression, he continued. Iron breaks. Stone cracks. But good oak bends. He rested a hand against the hull. Treat it well, and it may bring you home. His words remained with you long after the repair ended. Toward evening, another lookout spotted movement. Not whales. Something smaller. Several dark shapes drifted upon a nearby ice floe. The officers studied them through spyglasses. Seals. Immediately, excitement spread through the crew. Not wild excitement. Hope. Fresh meat. Fresh fat. Perhaps even fresh skins. After weeks of salted provisions, almost anything freshly hunted became a welcome change. The captain approved a landing party. Unlike whale hunting, seal hunting required men to leave the relative safety of the ship entirely. The whaleboat approached the ice cautiously. The floe creaked beneath gentle swells. At first, the seals seemed unconcerned. Several lay sleeping. Others simply watched the approaching men with enormous dark eyes. The hunters moved slowly. Very slowly. Firearms certainly existed during the 17th century, but they were unreliable in damp Arctic weather, slow to reload, and loud enough to frighten every animal nearby. Clubs and spears often proved more practical. You remained in the boat while several experienced sailors climbed carefully onto the ice. Every footstep mattered. Pack ice was unpredictable. A surface appearing solid could conceal narrow cracks filled with freezing seawater. The seals finally sensed danger. One slipped gracefully into the ocean. Another followed. The remaining animals hesitated just long enough. The hunt ended quickly. By sunset, several fresh carcasses hung beside the ship. That night, the cook prepared roasted seal meat. It tasted stronger than beef. Some compared it to very rich venison. Others claimed it resembled nothing they had ever eaten before. No one complained. More importantly, fresh meat meant fresh nutrients. Although 17th century sailors knew nothing of vitamin C, experienced captains had observed that crews eating fresh meat whenever possible often remained healthier than those surviving entirely upon salted food. Whether they understood the science hardly mattered. Experience had taught them enough. For the first time in many days, spirits improved. Songs quietly returned after supper. One sailor produced a battered fiddle that had somehow survived both the storm and the whale processing. Its music drifted gently across the calm sea. Several men tapped their boots against the deck. Others simply listened. Even the captain remained outside longer than usual. Not smiling exactly, but less burdened than before. As darkness settled, the northern sky produced another surprise. Soft curtains of pale green light began shimmering above the horizon. At first they appeared almost like thin clouds. Then they moved, flowing silently across the stars, growing brighter with every passing minute. Many sailors removed their hats instinctively. Some whispered prayers. Others stared without speaking. The aurora borealis remained poorly understood in the 17th century. Some believed it represented heavenly armies. Others feared it foretold storms, famine, or death. A few considered it a blessing. Willem watched the lights for a long time before quietly saying, "The first voyage, I thought angels were walking across the sky. And now you asked." He smiled without taking his eyes from the glowing heavens. "Now I know they're only lights." He paused. "But they still make me feel small." No one aboard could argue with that. Beneath those silent curtains of green, the ship seemed impossibly tiny against the vastness of the Arctic world. Yet while the crew found a rare moment of peace beneath the dancing sky, another threat was already quietly making its way toward them, not from the weather nor from the whales, but from within the ship itself. Hidden deep in the darkness below deck among the flour sacks, biscuit stores, and tightly packed cargo, thousands of tiny passengers had been multiplying unnoticed since the voyage began. And before long, the crew would discover that rats could be every bit as troublesome as storms. The first sign that something was wrong came not from the men, but from the food. It happened just before dawn. The cook entered the storage area carrying a lantern, expecting to collect another portion of flour and dried provisions for the morning meal. Instead, he stopped suddenly. The lantern flame trembled as he held it higher. A few moments later, his voice echoed through the lower deck. "Captain." That single word was enough to wake several sailors nearby. The tone mattered. It was not fear. Not yet. But concern. The captain arrived within minutes, followed by the ship's officers and the cooper. Together, they descended into the cramped stow. Rage space beneath the deck. The smell immediately revealed the problem. Spoiled grain. Damp wood. Animal waste. The signs were unmistakable. Rats. Every long voyage carried unwanted passengers. No matter how carefully sailors sealed their provisions, rats found ways aboard. They climbed ropes while ships sat in harbor. They slipped through gaps in cargo. They hid among barrels and crates before the vessel ever left land. On a merchant ship carrying expensive goods, rats were a nuisance. On a whaling ship thousands of miles from shore, they were a serious threat. A single damaged food sack could mean losing precious supplies. A colony of rats could mean hunger, The sailors searched carefully, behind barrels, beneath crates, along the edges of the hull. At first they found only evidence: tiny footprints, chewed rope, small holes in sacks. Then one sailor spotted movement. A dark shape disappeared between two barrels. The chase began immediately. Men who had faced storms and whales now found themselves crawling through the darkness, hunting creatures only a few inches long. It seemed almost ridiculous, until everyone remembered what was at stake. A rat did not need much food, but hundreds of rats did, and ships had sunk because of smaller problems. The carpenter built traps using spare wood and iron pieces. The cook mixed bait from leftover scraps. Sailors were ordered to keep all food containers sealed. Every evening, another inspection was performed. The battle against the rats became another routine added to the endless list of duties aboard the ship. Hunt whales, repair sails, pump water, clean decks, fight disease, control pests, survive. That was the true life of a 17th-century whaler. Not adventure, not glory, survival. Several days passed. The weather remained unusually calm, allowing the crew to continue searching the rich northern waters. But the calm brought another challenge: boredom. Modern people often imagine boredom as a minor inconvenience. On a 17th-century whaling voyage, boredom could become dangerous. The same ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. The same gray horizon appeared every morning. The same wooden walls surrounded sailors every night. There were no newspapers, no music streaming, no conversations with distant family, no simple escape from routine. A man's thoughts became his own company, and sometimes that was the hardest company to endure. Some sailors became quiet. Some became restless. Others searched constantly for distractions. One afternoon, two young crewmen began arguing over a meaningless disagreement about rope storage. The argument grew louder, then angrier. Within moments, men who had worked beside each other for months were threatening violence. The boatswain separated them quickly. Afterward, Willem explained something you had begun to understand. On land, a man can walk away. He looked around the cramped deck. Here, he pointed toward the endless sea. There is nowhere to walk. A ship created its own strange society. Every person depended on every other person. A careless sailor could endanger everyone. A selfish decision could affect the entire crew. Discipline was not simply about obedience. It was about survival. The captain maintained strict rules for exactly this reason. Fighting, stealing, ignoring orders, damaging equipment, all carried punishment. Not because captains enjoyed authority, because a ship where every man acted only for himself would not survive long. One evening, the captain gathered the crew. Not for punishment, for news. The whale sightings had decreased. The waters they had been following seemed quieter. The captain believed the whales had moved farther north. That meant another difficult decision: follow them deeper into colder waters, or begin the journey home. No sailor spoke. Everyone understood the importance of the choice. Returning early meant fewer barrels of oil, lower profits, disappointed investors, possibly angry families waiting at home. Continuing north meant greater risk. More storms, more ice, more distance from safety. The captain studied the horizon. We continue. A simple decision. A dangerous one. The following morning, the ship changed course. Northward. Farther from the familiar routes. Farther from any chance of quick rescue. The crew prepared again. Whale boats checked. Weapons sharpened. Barrels counted. Water measured. The voyage was entering a new stage. One where the greatest dangers were no longer unexpected. They were chosen. As the ship moved deeper into Arctic waters, the landscape itself began changing. The open sea became crowded with floating ice. Large pieces drifted silently beside the hull. Some were small enough to avoid. Others were massive fields stretching beyond sight. The captain ordered slower sailing. Speed mattered less than survival. A ship damaged by ice could be repaired. A ship trapped by ice could become a frozen grave. The temperature dropped further. Morning frost covered the deck before sunrise. Sailors wrapped additional layers around themselves, though clothing options were limited. Most wore wool garments, heavy coats, and leather coverings. But wool has limits. Once soaked, it becomes heavy and loses much of its insulating ability. Many sailors learned this painful lesson. Wet clothing in freezing conditions was not merely uncomfortable. It was dangerous. The surgeon began watching for signs of frostbite. Pale fingers, numb toes, skin losing sensation. The early stages were easy to ignore. That made them deadly. A sailor might think his hands were simply cold. Hours later, damaged tissue could become permanent. One morning, the surgeon examined a young sailor named Peter. His fingertips had turned white. The surgeon's expression changed immediately. How long? Peter looked confused. How long what? Since you felt them. Peter hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. The surgeon sighed. You cannot trust numbness. The crew gathered around as the sailors' hands were slowly warmed. No one joked. No one laughed. Because everyone knew frostbite did not care how brave a man was. The sea had many ways to defeat people. Sometimes it arrived as a storm. Sometimes as a whale. Sometimes as something as small as frozen fingers. Several days later, the ship reached an area where whales were again appearing. The lookout became almost constantly occupied. The crew knew another hunt was coming. But this time, something felt different. The men were no longer inexperienced newcomers. They had survived storms. They had faced ice. They had watched enormous creatures die beneath their hands. The sea had changed them. You noticed it in the way they moved. The first weeks aboard, every command caused confusion. Now men reacted before orders were completed. They understood the ship's language. The creak of wood. The pull of rope. The direction of wind. The mood of the ocean. You had changed too. The person who first stepped onto the ship months earlier had imagined whaling as a dangerous adventure. Now you understood the truth. It was not adventure. It was endurance. And endurance demanded a price. That price was paid in exhaustion, fear, pain, and time. Late one afternoon, the familiar cry once again came from the masthead. There she blows. But this time, the lookout's voice carried something unusual. Urgency. Not one whale. Not three. A massive group. The sea ahead was alive with movement. Hundreds of tons of living giants traveled beneath the Arctic sky. The captain raised his telescope, then lowered it slowly. Something about the scene troubled him. The whales were there. The opportunity was enormous. But beyond them, on the horizon, a dark wall was rising. Not clouds. Not fog. Something else. A storm system far larger than the one they had already survived was approaching. And this time, the captain faced a decision that would test everything he knew about the sea. Chase the whales and risk being trapped in worsening weather. Or abandon a fortune floating just beyond reach and turn towards safety. The captain remained motionless for several seconds, the telescope still resting loosely in his hand. The whales were there. The opportunity every sailor aboard had dreamed of. After weeks of searching, after storms, ice, hunger, and exhaustion, the sea had finally offered them what they came for. A fortune. Not a small fortune either. A group of whales this size could fill barrels that would make investors in Europe celebrate. It could transform a disappointing voyage into a profitable one. It could mean better wages, debt paid, and families receiving money they desperately needed. But the captain was not looking only at the whales. He was looking beyond them. At the horizon, the darkening sky, the strange movement of clouds, the changing color of the water. A younger sailor might have seen only opportunity. An experienced captain saw a warning. The first mate approached quietly. Captain. The captain did not answer immediately. Finally, he lowered the telescope. How long until the weather reaches us? The first mate looked toward the approaching darkness. Perhaps 6 hours. Perhaps. The officer hesitated. In these waters, perhaps is the best anyone can offer. That was the truth of Arctic sailing. Nature did not provide schedules. The storm could arrive in 6 hours. Or 3. Or perhaps not at all. The ocean was unpredictable, and every decision carried consequences. The crew waited. Everyone knew what decision was coming. The captain turned toward the whales once more. The nearest animals surfaced in the distance, their breath rising like white smoke against the cold air. They moved slowly and peaceful, lie unaware that human beings were debating whether to pursue them. Finally, the captain spoke. "Prepare the boats." A wave of movement crossed the deck. The hunt would continue. But the captain added another order. Everyone returns immediately at the first sign of worsening weather. No one celebrated, because they understood what he meant. The whales were valuable, but the ship was more valuable. Without the ship, there would be no oil, no wages, no return home. The whale boats were lowered once again. The routine that had once terrified you now felt familiar. The weapons, the ropes, the silent preparation, the careful movements. Experience had replaced panic. But experience did not remove danger. It only taught you how close danger always was. Your boat moved across the cold water toward the whales. This time there were several targets. The sea seemed alive. Every few minutes, another enormous body appeared. A back breaking the surface. A tail disappearing beneath the waves. A powerful breath echoing across the distance. The sight was extraordinary. Almost peaceful. It was easy to forget why you were there. Then the harpooner lifted his weapon, and the illusion disappeared. The first strike came quickly. A whale near the surface took the iron. The line exploded from its coil. The familiar danger returned. Men shouted. Oars struck the water. The wounded creature pulled the boat forward with terrifying strength. But this time something was different. The wind. It had changed. Only slightly. A less experienced sailor might not notice. But every veteran did. The air had become sharper. The waves were beginning to rise. Far away, the storm was approaching. You looked toward the horizon. The dark wall of clouds had grown larger. Much larger. The captain's warning echoed in your mind. Return at the first sign. But the whale was still fighting. The line remained tight. The animal had not yet exhausted itself. And abandoning the hunt now meant losing the catch. The harpooner glanced toward the sky, then toward the whale. Every man aboard understood the struggle happening inside him. The hunter wanted victory. The sailor wanted survival. Finally, the first mate's boat gave the signal. Return. The hunt was over. Even successful hunts had limits. Your crew began the difficult process of retrieving the line and securing the whale. The decision frustrated everyone, but no one argued, because the ocean had already taught them one important lesson. Greed was dangerous. Fear was dangerous. Only judgment kept men alive. The return journey to the ship was harder than expected. The wind had strengthened faster than predicted. Waves pushed against the boats. The distance that had seemed small during calm conditions now felt enormous. Each stroke of the oar required more effort. Rain began falling. Not heavily, almost gently. That worried the older sailors more than a violent downpour. Storms often announced themselves quietly before revealing their true power. By the time the whale was secured beside the ship, the first drops had become freezing rain. The crew worked quickly. No processing. No celebration. The whale would have to wait. The ship came first. Sails were reduced. Equipment secured. Boats raised. Everything not essential was tied down. The atmosphere aboard changed completely. During a hunt, men focused outward. Now they focused inward. Every sailor knew what was coming. The storm arrived just after sunset. The first blast struck the ship so suddenly that several men lost their footing. The ocean rose around them. Within minutes, the world became darkness and noise. Wind screamed through the rigging. Rain hammered the deck. The ship shook as waves struck from every direction. This storm was different from the previous one. The earlier storm had been violent. This one felt endless. The ship climbed enormous waves only to crash into valleys of black water. Every movement became difficult. Every task became dangerous. The crew returned to the same exhausting routine. Pump. Secure. Repair. Hold. Survive. Below deck, conditions became unbearable. The air grew warmer and more humid from dozens of bodies trapped together. Wet clothing hung everywhere. The smell of damp wool, smoke, sickness, and unwashed men filled the narrow spaces. Sleep became almost impossible. A sailor might finally close his eyes, only to be awakened moments later by the ship violently rolling beneath him. The wounded men suffered the most. The sailor with the broken leg from the previous storm cried out whenever the ship dropped suddenly. There was little the surgeon could do. Pain medicine was limited. Comfort was limited. Hope was limited. The surgeon sat beside him for hours, not because he could heal the injury, but because sometimes a person needed someone nearby more than they needed treatment. That was another reality of old ships. Medical care was often less about curing disease and more about preventing despair. During the second night of the storm, disaster nearly arrived. A tremendous wave struck the port side. The impact sounded like an explosion. Several barrels broke loose below deck. The ship tilted sharply. Men grabbed whatever they could. The loose cargo crashed through the storage area. One barrel smashed against a support beam. Another broke apart completely. Whale oil spilled across the floor. The smell was overwhelming. More importantly, oil was dangerous. Slippery. Flammable. Difficult to clean during a storm. The crew worked desperately to secure the remaining cargo. For hours, they fought against the ship itself. Every wave shifted something. Every movement created another problem. Near dawn, the wind finally weakened. Not completely, but enough. The exhausted crew stood on deck watching the first pale light appear. Nobody spoke. Everyone looked older. The storm had lasted less than 2 days. Yet it felt like months. The captain inspected the damage. Several repairs were needed. More supplies had been lost. The whale remained secured, but processing it would have to wait until conditions improved. Then came another piece of news. The navigator entered the captain's cabin carrying the charts. His expression was serious. The storm had pushed them far from their planned position. They were no longer certain exactly where they were. In ordinary waters, that was a problem. In Arctic waters, it was dangerous, because somewhere ahead lay the edge of the ice, and somewhere behind them lay home. But between those 2 points was a vast, unforgiving ocean. The captain studied the charts for a long time. Then he looked outside toward the endless gray horizon. The voyage had already taken more from them than anyone expected. Yet they were not finished. The barrels were not full. The season was not over. And somewhere beyond the fog, more whales still waited. But now every sailor understood something they had not understood when they first left port. The greatest challenge of a 17th-century whaling voyage was not finding whales. It was surviving everything that happened after you found them. The captain remained inside his cabin long after the storm had passed. That alone was unusual. The captains of whaling ships were not men who wasted time. Every hour mattered. Every decision affected the survival of the crew and the profit of the voyage. A delayed order could mean damaged equipment, lost whales, or worse. But this time, the captain sat quietly over his charts. The navigator stood nearby, waiting. Outside, the ship creaked with every movement of the waves. The storm had weakened, but the ocean had not returned to peace. Long swells continued to lift the vessel slowly, reminding everyone that the sea never truly rested. Finally, the captain placed his finger on the map. "We are here." The navigator looked carefully. "Approximately." That single word carried the weight of the entire problem. Approximately. Navigation in the 17th century was an art built from estimates. Sailors used compasses, hourglasses, speed calculations, celestial observations, and experience. But storms could destroy the accuracy of even the best calculations. A ship could believe it was in one location while actually being dozens of miles away. In open ocean, that error might be forgiven. Near Arctic ice, it could become fatal. The captain folded the chart. "How much farther until we reach safer waters?" The navigator hesitated. "That depends on the wind." Again, the answer was honest. The sea controlled everything. Not the captain. Not the crew. Not the investors waiting across the Atlantic. The ocean decided. When the captain finally stepped back onto the deck, the crew immediately noticed his expression. The storm had not broken him, but it had changed something. The men gathered around as repairs continued. The captain spoke clearly. "We remain in these waters for 2 more days." A few sailors exchanged looks. 2 days meant more hunting, more oil, more danger. "If we find enough whales," he continued, "we begin our return." No one questioned him. Every sailor understood the hidden meaning. The voyage had reached its limit. They were no longer chasing endless fortune. They were trying to bring home what they had earned. The next morning, the crew returned to processing the whale captured before the storm. After days of delay, the work was even more difficult. The carcass had changed. Cold temperatures slowed decay, but the outer layers had become harder to cut. The frozen surface resisted every blade. Men swung their cutting spades repeatedly, breaking through thick layers of tissue. The work was brutal. The ship once again became a floating factory. The same smell returned. Blood, salt, smoke, hot oil. The deck became covered with a mixture of water and grease, creating a surface more dangerous than ice. Every sailor moved carefully. One careless step could send a man sliding beneath ropes, hooks, or machinery. The danger was not dramatic. It was ordinary. And that made it worse. Most accidents aboard historical ships did not happen during famous moments. They happened during routine. A sailor carrying supplies. A man climbing stairs. Someone turning too quickly with a tool in hand. Fatigue was the invisible enemy. The longer a voyage continued, the more likely someone was to make a mistake. You began noticing small changes among the crew. Men who once laughed loudly now conserved their energy. Conversations became shorter. Arguments became less frequent. Not because everyone had become kinder. Because everyone was tired. Exhaustion had a strange effect. It removed unnecessary emotions. Only important things remained. Food, sleep, safety, home. That word appeared more often in conversations now. Not openly, usually in small moments. A sailor staring at the horizon. A man repairing a jacket while talking about his children. Someone describing the smell of fresh bread from his village. The sea created a strange relationship with memory. The farther sailors traveled from land, the more powerful ordinary things became. A warm room. A wooden chair. A familiar voice. Things people ignored on land became treasures in the middle of the ocean. One evening, while repairing rope near the stern, you overheard two sailors discussing their return. If the wages are good, I will buy a small piece of land. The other laughed. You said that last voyage. I know. And the voyage before that. The first sailor smiled. Then perhaps I am finally learning. Willem, sitting nearby, listened quietly. After they left, he looked toward you. Every sailor returns with a dream. What is yours? You asked. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he answered. To stop leaving. The simplicity of his answer surprised you. After decades at sea, after countless journeys, after surviving storms and hunts, the old sailor did not dream of adventure. He dreamed of stillness. That night, the captain received unexpected news from the lookout. More whales. Not a large group, but enough. The decision was made quickly. One final hunt. The crew prepared without excitement. That was perhaps the biggest difference. The first time you entered a whale boat, your hands shook. Now you checked your equipment calmly. You understood the danger. You respected it. But you no longer imagined yourself separate from it. The sea had become something you lived inside. The boats moved away from the ship. The morning was unusually beautiful. Clear sky, gentle waves, a cold wind carrying the smell of distant ice. For a moment, it almost seemed peaceful. Then the whale appeared. A massive creature surfaced ahead. The harpooner waited. No one moved. The boat drifted closer. Closer. The weapon flew. This time, the hunt went differently. The whale did not flee immediately. Instead, it turned directly toward them. The reaction was instant. Back. The oars struck the water. The whale's massive head approached beneath the surface. For a moment, no one could see exactly where it was. That was the terrifying part. The largest danger was often the thing hidden beneath the water. Then the whale surfaced. Too close. The wave from its movement struck the boat. Everyone grabbed whatever they could. The vessel tilted dangerously. Water rushed over the side. One sailor lost his grip. For a brief second, his entire body hung halfway outside the boat. Two men grabbed him and pulled him back. The whale disappeared again. The harpoon line tightened, then loosened, then tightened once more. The animal was moving unpredictably. The harpooner stared at the rope. Something was wrong. The line had wrapped. A dangerous situation. If the rope tangled around the boat, everyone aboard could be pulled into disaster. The harpooner shouted instructions. Every man moved. They cut, adjusted, released tension. The process took only seconds. But those seconds felt endless. Finally, the line cleared. The boat drifted free. The whale surfaced again in the distance. This time the crew waited. They had learned patience. Minutes passed. Then the final strike came. Hours later, the whale was secured. Another victory. Another burden. Because every success required work. There was no simple moment of triumph. No celebration. Only more labor. As the ship processed its final catch, the captain made his decision. They would leave. The northern waters had given them fortune. They had taken enough. Now they needed to survive the journey home. The crew prepared for departure. Barrels were counted. Sails repaired. Weapons stored. The whale boats secured. The ship that had arrived months earlier carrying inexperienced sailors was now a different vessel. Not stronger, not safer, but changed. The men aboard had changed with it. You stood near the railing, watching the Arctic horizon disappear. Behind them, the place that had seemed endless now felt strangely familiar. You remembered the fear you felt when you first saw a whale. The panic during your first storm. The misery of hunger. The exhaustion of endless work. All of it had become part of your story. But the journey home had only begun. And every sailor knew something important. The most dangerous part of a voyage was not always the beginning. Sometimes, the greatest dangers waited when men believed they were finally safe. The decision to turn south should have brought relief. For many sailors, it did. The mood aboard the ship changed almost immediately after the captain gave the order to leave the Arctic hunting grounds behind. Men spoke more often. They began repairing personal belongings they had ignored for months. Some sailors cleaned their clothing. Others checked the small possessions they had carried from home, as if touching those objects reminded them that another world still existed beyond the endless ocean. But experienced sailors knew better. A journey was not finished when a ship turned toward home. A journey was finished only when a man's feet touched solid ground again. The captain repeated this warning several times. No one celebrates until we reach harbor. Nobody argued. They had seen too many voyages end within sight of success. A ship could survive months of storms and still be lost during the final days. The ocean did not care how close home was. The first week of the return voyage passed slowly. The wind remained favorable, allowing the ship to make steady progress southward. The great northern ice fields gradually disappeared behind them. The temperature became slightly warmer. The days felt longer. The air no longer carried the same bitter Arctic cold. For many sailors, these changes felt like returning to life. But the ship itself carried the scars of the voyage. The damaged mast still required careful monitoring. Several sections of the deck had been repaired with newer wood that looked different from the original boards. The whale boats showed scratches and cracks from countless encounters with the sea. The sails carried patches from storms and hard labor. The vessel was a record of everything the crew had survived. Every mark had a story. One sailor would point to a repaired railing and say, "That came from the first storm." Another would touch a damaged beam. "That was the whale." Another would simply look at the empty space where a piece of equipment had been lost and remember someone who was no longer aboard. Because not everyone who left the harbor would return. The sea always collected a price. As the ship moved farther south, the crew began noticing another problem. The food stores were shrinking faster than expected. The voyage had lasted longer than planned. More days at sea meant more meals. More meals meant fewer supplies. The captain ordered another inspection. The results were uncomfortable. The remaining salted meat was limited. The biscuit stores had suffered from insects and moisture. Fresh water was still carefully rationed. The crew was not starving, but they could no longer afford waste. Every portion mattered. The cook became almost obsessive about measurements. A handful of grain, a small piece of meat, a controlled amount of water. Sailors who had once complained about food now ate every crumb. Hunger changes perspective. A month earlier, men had thrown away pieces of biscuit because they disliked the taste. Now they collected every fragment from the table. Nothing was wasted. Nothing. One evening, a young sailor found himself staring at another man's untouched portion. The older sailor noticed. Without saying anything, he pushed half of his meal across the table. The young man hesitated. "I can't take it." The older sailor shrugged. "You can, but you need it." The man smiled. "We all do." That was another lesson the sea taught. A ship survived because people depended on one another. Not because they were always kind. Not because they were always friends. Because survival demanded cooperation. Several days later, the first signs of illness appeared. At first, it seemed minor. A few sailors complained of weakness. Some had aching joints. Others felt unusually tired despite sleeping. The surgeon examined them carefully. He knew these symptoms. The crew had been at sea too long. Fresh food had been limited for months. The old enemy had returned. Scurvy. In the 17th century, sailors understood that certain foods helped prevent the disease, but the scientific explanation remained unknown. Many captains experimented with different solutions. Some carried preserved fruit. Some relied on traditional remedies. Others simply hoped luck would protect their crew. Luck was not always enough. The surgeon searched through the remaining supplies. Anything that might help. Stored onions. Certain preserve. Ed foods. Whatever remained. But the reality was obvious. The crew needed land. They needed fresh provisions. They needed time away from the ocean. The captain increased efforts to reach warmer waters. The ship moved south. Every day mattered. Meanwhile, another problem developed. The rats had not disappeared. Despite months of traps and hunting, some remained hidden. Now, with food supplies reduced, they became more noticeable. At night, sailors heard movement beneath the deck. Scratching. Running. Small creatures fighting over the last pieces of food. One sailor joked that the rats might arrive home before the crew. Nobody laughed much. Everyone knew there was truth behind the joke. The return journey also brought a new psychological challenge. After months of constant danger, peace itself felt strange. During storms, every man had a purpose. Every command mattered. Every second required attention. Now during calm seas, thoughts returned. Memories. Regrets. Fears. Some sailors struggled with the quiet. A man who had survived a violent storm might wake suddenly at night, convinced the ship was sinking. Another might stare at the ocean for hours without speaking. The sea left marks that were not always visible. Willem noticed this. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the western horizon, he sat beside you. You think the hardest part is the storm? He shook his head. No. The hardest part is when the storm ends. You looked at him. Why? Because during the storm, you know what you are fighting. He looked toward the calm water. But after... He paused. After, you have to remember who you were before. Those words stayed with you. Because the voyage had changed everyone aboard. Some changes were obvious. Stronger hands. Harder faces. Weathered skin. Others were hidden. a different understanding of fear, a different respect for ordinary life, a different appreciation for simply being alive. After several more weeks, the first signs of civilization finally appeared. Birds, not Arctic birds, familiar birds, then floating pieces of wood, then distant traces of land carried by the wind. The crew became quieter. Everyone searched the horizon. No one wanted to be the first to believe they saw something. Hope could be painful if it disappeared. Then one morning, the lookout climbed down from the mast with a smile. A rare sight. The crew gathered. "What did you say?" He pointed ahead. "Land." The word spread instantly. Land. After months surrounded by endless water, the word felt almost unreal. Men who had faced whales without fear now struggled to hide their emotions. Some laughed. Some prayed. Some simply stood silently. The shoreline slowly appeared. Green. Solid. Beautiful. The ship continued forward. But nobody moved too quickly. Nobody celebrated too soon. Because one final challenge remained. The harbor. The place where every sailor dreamed of arriving. And the place where many ships had been lost during the final moments. Unknown to the crew, the same wind that had carried them home was beginning to shift. The harbor entrance ahead was narrow. The currents were strong. The ship was heavy with barrels of whale oil. And after months at sea, every sailor aboard wanted only one thing: to step onto land. But the sea had one final question for them. Would it allow them to leave? The sight of land changed everything. For months, the horizon had been an endless circle of gray water and empty sky. Now, for the first time in what felt like an entire lifetime, there was something permanent ahead. Trees, hills, smoke rising from distant chimneys. Home. The word carried a meaning it had never possessed before. When you first left the harbor, land had represented limitation, a place of poverty, debt, and uncertainty. The sea had seemed like an escape, a place where fortune waited for those brave enough to chase it. Now the opposite was true. The ocean represented everything that had tried to take you away. The storms, the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, the constant possibility that one mistake would erase your name from the world. The shoreline ahead represented warmth, safety, people who knew you, or at least remembered who you had been. But the captain refused to allow celebration. Not yet. The ship still had to enter the harbor. And a whaling ship returning from the Arctic was not the same vessel that had left months earlier. She carried hundreds of barrels of whale oil below deck. Her hull was heavier. Her rigging was damaged. Her crew was exhausted. A harbor entrance that looked harmless from a distance could become deadly when currents, wind, and weight combined. The pilot boat approached shortly after midday. A small vessel carrying a local navigator came alongside. The pilot climbed aboard and immediately began examining the ship. He looked at the sails. the rigging, the condition of the deck. Then he looked at the crew. For a moment, he said nothing. Perhaps he had seen this expression before. Men returning from long voyages often looked older than when they departed. Not only physically, something deeper changed. The pilot spoke with the captain quietly. Then orders began. Reduce sail. Prepare lines. Stand by anchors. The final approach had begun. The harbor grew closer. More details appeared. Buildings, docks, people. The crew could hear sounds they had almost forgotten. Hammers striking wood. Carts rolling over stone. Voices. Land sounds. Ordinary sounds. Yet after months of only wind and waves, they felt extraordinary. Several sailors stood near the railing watching silently. One man removed his hat. Another whispered a prayer. Willem simply stared. You expected him to say something. After all his warnings. After all his years. But the old sailor remained quiet. Finally, you asked, "Are you not happy?" He looked at the shore. "I am." "Then why so serious?" He smiled slightly. "Because every sailor knows something." "What?" "The sea lets you leave." He looked back toward the endless water behind them. "But it never really lets you forget." The ship moved slowly through the harbor entrance. The wind shifted. Immediately the crew reacted. Ropes tightened. Commands echoed. The vessel turned. For a few tense moments, everything depended on timing. The captain watched carefully. The pilot gave directions. The helmsman adjusted the course. A mistake now could damage months of work. The ship passed safely between the harbor markers. Only then did the captain allow himself a small breath of relief. The crew noticed. Some smiled. A few laughed. The tension that had surrounded them for months finally began to break. The anchor dropped. The chain thundered downward. The sound echoed across the harbor. The voyage was over. At least physically. The ship stopped moving. After months of constant motion, the stillness felt strange. Many sailors stumbled slightly when they first stepped onto the dock. Their bodies had adapted to the rhythm of the ocean. Solid ground felt unfamiliar. The first person to greet the crew was not a wealthy merchant. Not an official. Not an investor. It was a group of families waiting near the dock. Some cried. Some shouted names. Some simply stood frozen, unable to believe the person they had feared lost was standing before them. Not everyone received such a welcome. Every returning ship carried empty spaces. Names that would not be called. Families that would not run forward. The captain removed his hat as the crew unloaded. Respect was shown quietly. The sea had taken people. Everyone knew. The barrels of whale oil were counted carefully. Merchants inspected the cargo. Numbers were written. Calculations were made. To investors, the voyage became a collection of statistics. Barrels produced. Costs recorded, profits calculated. But to the sailors, those barrels represented something different. Every barrel carried memories. Every drop of oil represented cold mornings, bloody hands, sleepless nights, storms, fear, survival. The payment process began within days. Some sailors received their wages immediately. Others discovered deductions, damaged equipment, lost supplies, debts owed before the voyage. A young sailor who had imagined returning wealthy found that his earnings were far smaller than expected. This was another harsh reality of whaling. The danger was enormous. The reward was not always. Many ordinary sailors risked their lives while merchants and ship owners collected much of the fortune. Yet many returned anyway, because the alternative was often worse. Poverty on land, hunger, no work, no opportunities. The sea was dangerous. But for many men, it was one of the few places where a poor person could still hope to earn something. After receiving your own payment, you walked through the town. Everything felt different. The streets seemed too narrow. The buildings seemed too permanent. People moved slowly, carefully. On the ship, every movement had purpose. On land, people wasted time without realizing it. They stopped to talk. They watched passing carts. They sat comfortably indoors. Simple things amazed you. A warm room, a fresh meal, clean clothing. The smell of bread from a bakery nearly stopped you in the street. For months you had dreamed about such things. Now that they were available, they felt almost overwhelming. That evening, you returned to the harbor. The whaling ship remained tied to the dock. From a distance, she looked smaller than you remembered. It was strange. At sea, she had seemed like the entire world. Now she was simply a ship. Wood, rope, canvas, nothing more. And yet, everything. You understood then why sailors returned again and again despite everything they suffered. The ship was not only a place of danger. It was also the place where they discovered what they were capable of surviving. The voyage had stripped away illusions. It had shown the true cost behind every barrel of whale oil burning in distant cities. People who lit lamps at night rarely imagined the frozen oceans, exhausted sailors, and dangerous hunts behind that small flame. They saw only light. They never saw the darkness required to create it. Months passed after the voyage. Life slowly returned to normal. Your hands remained scarred. Certain sounds still reminded you of storms. Sometimes the smell of smoke and oil brought back memories of the Arctic. At night, you occasionally woke believing you were still aboard the ship. Feeling the floor move beneath you. Hearing the ropes above. Waiting for the next command. The sea had followed you home. One afternoon, you walked past the harbor and saw another whaling ship preparing to depart. Young men stood on the deck. Excited. Nervous. Dreaming of fortune. You recognized the expression. You had worn it once. A recruiter spoke to them about wages and adventure. He did not mention the frozen nights, the sickness, the dangerous ropes, the storms, the loneliness. He did not mention that a 17th-century whaling ship was not an adventure. It was a test of endurance, a battle against nature, a struggle against exhaustion, a place where survival depended on discipline, luck, and the cooperation of strangers trapped together on a wooden vessel in the middle of a hostile ocean. You watched as the ship slowly left the harbor, the same way yours had. The sails filled, the ropes tightened, the distance grew, and as the vessel disappeared beyond the horizon, you finally understood the truth. You would not have survived that life because you were fearless. Nobody was. You survived because you learned when to be afraid. You learned to respect the ocean. You learned that courage was not the absence of fear. It was continuing despite it. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, another generation of sailors was beginning the same journey into the cold, endless sea. A journey toward wealth. A journey toward danger. A journey where every man aboard would eventually learn the same lesson. The ocean does not care about your dreams. It only asks one question. Can you survive? The question followed you long after the ship disappeared from sight. Can you survive? At first, you believed survival was simply reaching the shore alive. After everything you had endured, that seemed obvious. The storms, the freezing waters, the dangerous hunts, the endless labor, all of it had been a struggle between life and death. But as the months passed, you began to understand something deeper. Survival was not only about breathing. It was about carrying the memory of what happened without allowing it to destroy you. The sea remained inside every sailor who returned. Some men adapted quickly. They found work, married, rebuilt their lives, and rarely spoke about their voyages again. Others seemed unable to fully return. They walked the same streets, entered the same homes, and ate at the same tables, yet part of them remained somewhere far away among the waves. The whaling grounds, the storms, the endless horizon. You noticed it whenever you met another sailor from your old crew. They would greet each other warmly. They would laugh. They would discuss ordinary things. But eventually, almost always, the conversation would drift back. Do you remember that storm? Do you remember the whale that nearly overturned the boats? Do you remember Willem? That name always changed the mood. Because old Willem had not returned to sea after that voyage. Everyone expected him to. For decades, the ocean had been his home. Many believed he would return to the harbor one day, find another ship, and disappear again into the northern waters. But he did not. Instead, he rented a small room near the edge of town and lived quietly. You visited him several times. The first visit surprised you. The man who had seemed almost impossible to break aboard the ship now appeared strangely ordinary. He repaired fishing nets. He grew vegetables. He complained about the weather. It seemed impossible that the same hands had held a harpoon while standing beside a creature larger than a house. One afternoon, while sitting outside his small home, you asked him why he finally stopped sailing. He looked toward the distant harbor. "I realized something." "What?" "I spent my whole life trying to survive the sea." He smiled. "Then I discovered I wanted to survive land." You laughed. But he was serious. "The sea teaches you how small you are." He picked up a broken piece of rope beside him. "But people forget another lesson." "What lesson?" "That even small things matter." He held the rope between his fingers. "This rope is not impressive. No one writes stories about rope. But without it..." He let the sentence remain unfinished. You understood. A ship was not saved only by captains or heroes. It survived because thousands of ordinary things worked together. A strong rope, a sealed barrel, a repaired plank, a careful sailor, a person remembering an order at the right moment. History often remembers the dramatic moments. The whale attacks, the storms, the disasters. But most survival happened quietly, in ordinary decisions made every day. Years later, when you looked back at your first day aboard the whaling ship, you realized how little you understood. You had imagined that the whale was the enemy. You had imagined the storm was the enemy. You had imagined the cold was the enemy. But the truth was more complicated. The greatest enemy was human weakness. A sailor becoming careless. A crew losing discipline. A captain making a poor decision. A person believing they were stronger than nature. The ocean did not need to attack. It only needed humans to make one mistake. That was why experienced sailors seemed so cautious. They were not cowards. They were survivors. They knew exactly what the ocean could take. As the years passed, the world around you began changing. New technologies appeared. New methods of travel developed. The importance of whale oil slowly changed as other sources of energy became more common. But the old whaling days remained unforgettable. The stories survived, not because they were glamorous, not because they represented adventure, but because they revealed something about human endurance. A 17th-century whaling ship was a place where people faced conditions most modern humans would struggle to imagine. A wooden vessel, a frozen ocean, months away from home, limited food, limited medicine, no communication with the outside world, no rescue coming if something went wrong. The men aboard were not superheroes. They were farmers, laborers, fishermen, young men looking for opportunity, older men trying to earn one more successful voyage. They were ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. And that was what made their survival remarkable. One evening, many years after that first voyage, you returned to the harbor where your journey had begun. The docks looked different. New buildings had appeared. Different ships filled the water. The world continued moving forward. But near the edge of the harbor, you noticed an old vessel being prepared for another voyage. A whaling ship, smaller than the one you remembered. Yet the sight immediately brought back everything. The sound of ropes, the smell of tar, the feeling of cold wind against your face. For a moment, you were standing on that first deck again. Young, uncertain, completely unaware of what waited ahead. A group of new sailors stood nearby. They were laughing, talking about the money they would earn, the places they would see, the adventures they would experience. You almost walked away. Then you stopped, because you remembered something important. Every sailor before you had also been young once. Every experienced sailor had once been a beginner. Every person who survived had once stood exactly where those men stood. You approached them, not to frighten them, not to tell them they were foolish, because you knew they would not listen. No young sailor ever truly understands the sea before meeting it. Instead, you simply offered one piece of advice. Respect the ship. They looked at you curiously. You continued. Respect the weather. Respect your crew. And never believe you have defeated the ocean. One of the young men smiled. Is that all? You looked toward the water. No. You paused. Remember that the sea is not trying to kill you. The young sailors waited. It simply does not care whether you live. That was the lesson every whaler eventually learned. The ocean was not cruel. Cruelty required intention. The sea had no intention. It had no anger, no hatred, no mercy. It simply existed. Powerful, ancient, unchanged. Humans were the ones who entered its world. Humans were the ones who needed to adapt. And that was why so many people would never have survived a 17th century whaling ship. Not because they lacked strength, not because they lacked courage, but because that life demanded a type of endurance that modern comfort has almost erased. It demanded waking before sunrise in freezing darkness. It demanded eating food that most people today would refuse. It demanded working until your hands bled. It demanded trusting strangers with your life. It demanded facing creatures larger than buildings with nothing more than a wooden boat and an iron weapon. It demanded accepting that death was always nearby. And still, men went, again and again, because history is full of contradictions. The same ocean that terrified sailors also offered opportunity. The same ship that caused suffering also created friendships. The same voyage that nearly destroyed men often became the experience they remembered most clearly. Because hardship changes the way people see the world. After surviving the Arctic seas, a warm room felt like a treasure. After eating spoiled biscuit, fresh bread felt like a feast. After hearing only waves for months, a human voice became precious. The ordinary became extraordinary. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of the old whaling ships. They showed people the value of things they usually ignored. light, warmth, food, family, home. The very things sailors left behind were the things they appreciated most when they returned. And somewhere beneath the endless northern waves, whales continued their ancient journeys, moving through the oceans long before humans hunted them and long after those old wooden ships disappeared. The sea remained. The memories remained. And the stories remained. The stories of men who chased giants across frozen oceans. The stories of ships that fought against storms. The stories of ordinary sailors who discovered that survival was not about defeating nature. It was about learning to live beside it. Because in the end, the greatest challenge aboard a 17th-century whaling ship was never the whale. It was everything that came before and everything that came after. The harbor slowly became quiet as the years moved forward, but the memories of that voyage never truly faded. Time has a strange way of changing the size of things. The storms that once seemed endless became stories told beside warm fires. The freezing nights that once felt unbearable became moments remembered with a strange mixture of fear and gratitude. The enormous whales that once appeared like living mountains became symbols of a world that no longer existed in the same way. But the lessons remained. Because a 17th-century whaling voyage was never just a story about hunting whales. It was a story about people. People who left everything familiar behind. People who stepped onto wooden ships knowing that the ocean might never return them. People who accepted months of discomfort because survival and opportunity demanded sacrifice. When historians look back at these voyages, they often see numbers. The number of ships, the number of barrels of whale oil, the number of voyages completed, the amount of money earned. But behind every number was a human experience. A sailor waking before dawn with frozen hands. A cook trying to stretch limited supplies for another week. A carpenter repairing a damaged hull while waves crashed outside. A young man staring into the darkness during his first storm, wondering whether he had made the greatest mistake of his life. These moments rarely appeared in official records. Yet these were the moments that defined the voyage. The life of a whaler was built from thousands of small struggles. Not one dramatic battle. Not one single moment of bravery. But countless decisions repeated every day. Tie the rope correctly. Check the barrel again. Listen to the captain. Help the man beside you. Do not ignore the warning signs. These simple actions separated survival from disaster. A ship could have the strongest wood, the best captain, the most experienced sailors. But one careless mistake could change everything. That was why discipline mattered so much. Modern people sometimes imagine strict rules aboard old ships as unnecessary cruelty. And sometimes they were. Captains were not always fair. Punishments could be harsh. Life aboard a 17th-century vessel was not easy or equal. But there was another reality. A ship was a small world surrounded by an enormous one. There was nowhere to escape. No road home. No emergency service coming across the ocean. If the crew stopped working together, everyone suffered. The sea forced cooperation. It forced people who might never have met on land to depend on each other completely. A farmer's son, a fisherman, a former soldier, a young sailor seeking adventure, an old sailor seeking one final successful voyage. Different lives, different backgrounds, one ship, one fate. That was perhaps the strangest thing about life aboard a whaling vessel. The ocean removed many differences between people. A wealthy man's son could freeze just as easily as a poor man's son. A skilled sailor could make mistakes. A beginner could save lives. The sea judged everyone equally. And that understanding created a unique bond among sailors. They argued. They complained. They fought. But when danger arrived, those same men trusted each other with everything. A hand reaching for another hand during a storm. A sailor sharing food when supplies became limited. A crew working through exhaustion because one injured man needed help. These moments revealed the true character of people. Not when life was comfortable, when survival was uncertain. Years after the voyage, you often thought about the young sailors who continued leaving from the harbor. Some returned. Some did not. Some became experienced captains. Some never survived their first journey. The ocean created legends, but it also created forgotten names. Thousands of ordinary sailors disappeared into history without monuments or books. Yet their lives mattered. They carried industries. They supplied cities with light. They connected distant economies. They helped shape the world they lived in. The lamps burning in distant homes depended on people who had crossed dangerous oceans. People whose names were never written in history books. The whale oil trade was eventually replaced by new technologies. The great wooden whaling ships slowly disappeared. The old harbors became different places. The sounds changed. The ships changed. The world moved forward. But the ocean remained the same. Still powerful. Still unpredictable. Still capable of reminding humanity how small it truly was. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson from those old voyages. Humans often believe they control nature. They build larger ships, better tools, stronger machines. They cross greater distances. But the ocean has always carried the same message. You may enter my world. You may explore me. You may challenge me. But you will never command me completely. The sailors who survived understood this. They did not believe they had conquered the sea. They knew better. They had simply been allowed to return. That difference mattered. Because survival creates humility. A person who has watched a storm tear through a ship understands that strength is not everything. A person who has stood beside an enormous whale understands that humans are not the largest creatures in the world. A person who has spent months surrounded by nothing but water understands how precious ordinary life truly is. A warm meal, a dry bed, a familiar voice, a quiet evening without fear. These things became treasures. Things many people today experience every day without thinking. And perhaps that is why stories of old sailors continue to fascinate us. They remind us of a world where survival was closer, where every journey carried uncertainty, where people depended more directly on skill, courage, and one another. A world where comfort could not hide the reality of human vulnerability. The men aboard 17th-century whaling ships were not fearless. They were afraid. They worried about storms. They worried about sickness. They worried about never seeing home again. But they went anyway. That was their courage, not the absence of fear, the willingness to continue despite it. When you think about that old ship now, perhaps the most surprising thing is not that people survived. It is that they were able to find moments of happiness in such difficult conditions. They sang during storms. They laughed over terrible food. They shared stories beneath strange northern skies. They celebrated small victories. A successful hunt, a repaired mast, a calm morning, a glimpse of land. Human beings have always found ways to create light, even in the darkest places. And that may be the final truth of the whaling ships. They were places of suffering, but they were also places of friendship. They were places of danger, but they were also places of unforgettable experiences. They were places where ordinary people discovered extraordinary strength. The ocean tested them. The weather tested them. The whales tested them. But the greatest test was themselves. Could they remain calm when everything went wrong? Could they continue when exhaustion demanded surrender? Could they trust others when survival depended on cooperation? Those were the questions every sailor eventually answered. And the answers were written not in books, but in scars, in memories, in the stories passed from one generation to another. The 17th-century whaling ship is gone now. The wooden decks have disappeared. The sails have vanished. The voices of the sailors have grown silent. But their journey remains. A reminder of what humans once endured. A reminder of what people are capable of surviving. And a reminder that behind every simple object in history, there is often a hidden story of struggle. A lamp burning in a distant room. A barrel stored in a merchant's warehouse. A ship returning to harbor. Behind each one was a journey. Behind each journey were people. And behind those people was a choice. To step forward, to face uncertainty, to enter the unknown. Because the ocean never promised safety. The ship never promised comfort. The voyage never promised a return. But still, generation after generation, sailors climbed aboard. They raised the sails. They watched the shoreline disappear. And they sailed toward the horizon, not because they were fearless, but because humans have always been willing to risk everything for the hope of something more. That was the reality of life aboard a 17th-century whaling ship. Not an adventure, not a fantasy, a test, a struggle, a story of survival. And for those who lived through it, a story they would never forget. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.